The Israelites have been freed from the hands of Pharaoh and have been led out into the wilderness by Moses and Aaron. Moses was adopted into the house of Pharaoh by Pharaoh's daughter when he was a baby, having been abandoned to a basket in the Nile after Pharaoh enacted a policy that all the young boys must die. An Israelite whose life should have been dedicated to slave labor was taken into Pharaoh's home and now finds himself as an adult hearing the cries of his people crying out for freedom. The people lament and they cry out to God, and God calls Moses, a person in the perfect place to advocate for the Israelites. Moses tells Pharaoh to let his people go, and when he does not, God rains down 10 plagues in Egypt, ending with the death of all Egyptian firstborn children. The Israelites are spared from this final plague because they have put the blood of a lamb on their doorposts, marking them as God's own. This was the last straw for Pharaoh. So he lets the people go. Well, he gives them a head start before sending out his armies after them. Moses leads the people to the Red Sea, puts his staff in the sand, and the waters part to reveal dry land. The Israelites reach the other side in safety while the waters crash down back upon Pharaoh's armies. Free at last, free at last. So here they are, on the other side of captivity, out from under the thumb of Pharaoh, free from the cracking whips of slave drivers, and the grumbling begins. The grain they brought with them from Egypt has run out, and now the people are sure Moses has a plan not to prosper them, but to starve them, a plan not to lead them to continued freedom and autonomy, but perpetual thirst, plans not for life, but for death. The one who risked his neck in Pharaoh's house for them is now suspect. Their liberator is now their captor. It takes a few small meals for the people to start telling the story of Egypt completely differently. If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the hand of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate our fill of bread. You have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. The 1950s are what the people point to as the heyday of the mainline Protestant church. What you think of when you think of Sunday school is the model established in the 1950s. We look to this time and we think of the nuclear family, all dressed in their Sunday best, well-behaved or intently managed children, full pews, politeness, and financial thriving. Those were the good old days, we say. If only we could go back to doing everything exactly like we did then, we wouldn't be suffering so much now. We look to our leaders, our pastors, our bishops, and say, why aren't you doing what we know works? It only took a few lean years for the people to start telling the story of the 1950s very differently than it actually was. The economic growth for middle-class white men and their families was made possible by the creation of suburbs. The creation of suburbs were made possible by the construction of highways, which were intentionally built on top of thriving, non-white neighborhoods and marketplaces. The suburbs were created because white people didn't want to live next to black or brown or Asian people. The suburbs were created because real estate agents knocked on the doors of white homeowners to tell them that their new black neighbors drove down their property value and invited them to buy a new house out in the suburbs to maintain their wealth. The suburbs renewed segregation. The design of the suburbs prioritized single-family dwellings, and they prioritized transportation by car since it was removed from the city center, causing walkable, connected neighborhoods to disappear. The ethos of the 1950s valued conformity over autonomy, which speaks to the fullness of churches. Were people choosing to come to church out of a duty of faith or was it culturally expected of them? The Cold War lasted through and beyond this entire decade. Fear and suspicion reigned. Women, having entered the workforce during the war, were now facing rampant sexism and other challenges in remaining in the working world. Women could not open a bank account or a credit card. Women did not have financial autonomy. They could not leave their marriages, even if they were loveless and abusive, because they didn't have any of their own money. Those lovely, well-dressed, well-behaved children were ready for church because of Black and brown domestic labor in the household, not because parents just worked harder than they do now. Betty Friedan interviewed her female peers in 1957 who consistently gave chirpy, false answers to her questions. Upon digging deeper, she discovered a deep discontentment. The real problem, sociologist Friedan said, was embedded in the nature of the gender roles society had imposed on women. The women she met were intelligent, educated, talented, and yet they had no other outlets for their talents except housework, motherhood, and the companionship they offered their husbands. The feminine mystique, she wrote, has succeeded in burying millions of women alive. Gosh, those were the good old days. If we hadn't sold out to the feminist notions of choice and autonomy and personhood, these pews would be full. If we hadn't given in to the pressure of continuing racial equity, Black and brown women would still be as economically oppressed as they were then, forcing them into domestic service in our homes. I'm, of course, being facetious, but this is what it sounds like when we idolize the 1950s or when we idolize any part of the past. If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, we would have filled our bellies at the flesh pots. Full bellies is not the story God remembers. The state of the church or our world today is not something to idolize either. Our denomination is entrenched in conflict about whether or not we welcome everybody. Churches are disaffiliating, going through a sort of divorce. Abuse has been and continues to be uncovered. Gun violence is becoming a norm in every single community. And the majority of people do not make a wage they can live on. The wilderness, too, was nothing to write home about. There was scarcity and few opportunities for shade and no grocery store, and they lived in tents rather than homes. It wasn't easy. But it wasn't slavery in Egypt. It wasn't true and faithful to say that Egypt had been better. The place that they were, though challenging, was more dignifying than brick-making in Egypt. It was more real and honest and revealing than living under empire in Egypt. There was no propaganda machine out in the wilderness, just their own humanity, their own autonomy, their own wisdom to build a community and a society. And all of that felt scarce. That muscle that they had strengthened to lament to God, to their leaders, became rightfully so strong under Pharaoh, that is the easiest one to exercise when things become slightly inconvenient out in the wilderness. When we are out from under the thumb of Pharaoh, though, we must begin exercising a new muscle. In the verses to follow, we hear that though the people are complaining and are frustrating Moses and Aaron, God responds by assuring the people through Moses that manna will fall from heaven each day, and quails will be made available each evening. The muscle that God invites them to exercise is faithfulness. Out here in the wilderness, the call to action is trusting that God will provide. that we don't have to subject ourselves to the oppressive forces of the world in order to be safe, in order to survive. So out here, having wiggled a little bit, not completely, out from under the structural financial sexism, having wiggled out a bit, not completely, from the collective idolization of the suburbs, the call to action for us is trusting that God will lead us into a place of flourishing, that God has plans for our continued freedom, for our continued and perpetual liberation, that God has plans of prospering for all of us, for people of all races, all sexes and genders and sexual orientations, all nationalities. God never calls us to go back to Egypt in order for us to have full pews. God never calls us to go back to Egypt in order for our families to look perfect and nuclear. God always and forever is calling us into the renunciation of the spiritual forces of wickedness, to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Each age, each era has the possibility to oppress and the possibility to free. Each era has the possibility to resist or to perpetuate evil. Each age has the possibility to structure or to deconstruct injustice. Each era has the possibility for the spiritual forces of wickedness or the spiritual forces of benevolence to reign. There is no inevitable movement toward the good. We move in that direction only when we let go of whatever straws of security we grasped in an old era, and we trust that God's steadfastness will bring us into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, even if we ourselves never see it. It is here in the wilderness that we exercise our muscles of faith, trusting that God will give us what we need to be collectively nourished for the journey into the land that God has promised. It is here in the wilderness that God invites us to celebrate those graces of sustenance, the manna and the quail that God nourishes us with, as a sign that the year of Jubilee is here. This is a sign of God's coming kingdom. This is a sign of God's abundance. Hallelujah. There is nothing for us in the Egypts of our days. There is nothing substantial for us in selling ourselves out to sexism and racism and homophobia and xenophobia and perpetual suspicion of our neighbors. But there is something substantial waiting for us out here in the wilderness, in the place where we wander, trusting that what lies behind is not any better, and what lies ahead is worth whatever challenge we face here. May we be seekers of the substantial, letting go of the straws we once grasped and embracing the manna and the quails out here in the wilderness. Thanks be to God.